My in-laws spent 3 years calling me a gold digger behind my husband's back, whispering that I married him for his family's money. At this year's Thanksgiving dinner, they finally said it to my face in front of everyone. They went completely silent when my bodyguard walked through the door and called me Miss Delacroix, because they had no idea who I really was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to how this all started, because the truth is, I never intended to hide my identity from anyone. Sometimes life just unfolds that way, and before you know it, you're living a lie that isn't really a lie. It's just complicated. My name is Camille Russo, though for the past 3 years, everyone in Millbrook Heights has known me simply as Camille, the quiet bookstore owner who married above her station. What they don't know is that my full name is Camille Delacroix-Russo, and the Delacroix part comes with a trust fund that could buy their entire neighborhood twice over. I wasn't trying to be deceptive when I met my husband Julian Ashworth 4 years ago. I was genuinely trying to live a normal life, away from the suffocating world of Manhattan high society, where everyone knew my family name meant old money, charity galas, and a pharmaceutical empire built by my great-grandfather. After graduating from Columbia with a literature degree, I'd moved to this charming small town in upstate New York with one goal: to open a cozy bookstore and live like a regular person for once in my life. The bookstore, between the lines, became my sanctuary. It's a narrow, 3-story building on Maple Street, with exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and the kind of atmosphere that makes people want to spend entire afternoons curled up in the reading nooks I'd carefully designed. I served locally roasted coffee, hosted book clubs, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't Camille Delacroix, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune. I was just Camille, the friendly bookstore owner who remembered everyone's favorite genres and always had a recommendation ready. Julian wandered into my store on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October, soaking wet and looking for something to read while waiting for his car to be repaired at the garage down the street. He was tall, with kind brown eyes and an easy smile, wearing a simple sweater and jeans that suggested he was comfortable but not flashy with money. He asked for a recommendation for something engaging but not too heavy, and I handed him a mystery novel by Louise Penny. We ended up talking for 2 hours. He told me he was a marketing director for a regional chain of sporting goods stores, that he'd grown up in Millbrook Heights, and that he'd never met someone who could make book recommendations feel like reading someone's soul. I told him about my love for stories that transport you to different worlds, about how I dreamed of opening a bookstore since I was 12, and about how much I loved the sense of community in small towns. What I didn't tell him was that my dream bookstore was funded by a trust fund that generated more money in interest each month than most people made in a year. I didn't mention that I had a full security detail back in Manhattan, or that my last relationship had ended when I discovered my ex-fiancé had been photographed with me primarily to boost his social media following and business connections. Julian started coming by the store regularly. Sometimes he'd buy a book, sometimes he'd just grab a coffee, and we'd chat about whatever novel he was currently reading. He was refreshingly genuine. He didn't try to impress me with expensive gestures or name-drop important connections. Instead, he'd bring me fresh pastries from the local bakery, help me reorganize shelves when shipments came in, and listen with genuine interest when I'd get excited about a new author I'd discovered. When he asked me out officially, it was to the town's annual fall festival, hardly the kind of high society event I was used to. We shared caramel apples, rode the Ferris wheel, and talked until closing time about everything from favorite childhood books to our dreams for the future. He told me about his hope to eventually start his own business, maybe expand beyond sporting goods into outdoor adventure planning. I told him about my plans to add a small cafe section to the bookstore and maybe start hosting author readings. It felt perfect, precisely because it was so normal. The Ashworth family, I learned, was what people in Millbrook Heights considered well off. Julian's father, Robert, owned 3 hardware stores in the county and some rental properties. His mother, Patricia, came from a family that had owned the local newspaper for generations before selling it. They lived in a beautiful colonial house in the nicest part of town, belonged to the country club, and were used to being among the more affluent families in their social circle. When Julian introduced me to his parents 6 months into our relationship, I could see them trying to figure me out. I dressed well, but not ostentatiously, spoke intelligently about books and current events, and was clearly educated. But I also worked retail, lived in a small apartment above my store, and didn't seem to have family money. I was an enigma that didn't quite fit their expectations for their son's romantic interests. Patricia would ask subtle questions about my background, my family, where I'd gone to school. I answered honestly, but vaguely. Yes, I'd gone to Columbia. Yes, my family was from New York. No, they weren't particularly involved in my day-to-day life. What I didn't explain was that my parents lived in a penthouse on the Upper East Side, that my mother sat on the boards of 3 major museums, or that my father had been featured on the cover of Forbes twice. The whispers started early. I'd overhear fragments of conversations at town events. She seems nice, but what do we really know about her? Awfully convenient. A beautiful young woman with no apparent family showing up and catching Julian's attention. Those clothes aren't cheap, but she claims to live on a bookstore owner's salary. Julian either didn't hear these whispers or chose to ignore them. He was head over heels in love, and frankly, so was I. For the first time in my life, I was in a relationship where someone loved me for who I chose to be, not for what my family name could provide them. He proposed on the shore of Lake Millbrook at sunset, with a ring he'd saved for months to buy, and I said yes without a moment's hesitation. That was 2 years ago. We had a small, elegant wedding at the lake, and I officially became Camille Ashworth, though I kept the bookstore under my original name for consistency. Julian moved into the apartment above the store, and we started building what felt like a perfect life together. But the whispers never stopped. If anything, they got worse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The phone call came on a crisp November morning while I was arranging a display of new holiday releases in the front window of my bookstore. Julian had left early for a meeting with potential investors. He was finally moving forward with his dream of starting an outdoor adventure company, and I couldn't have been prouder of him. "Camille, dear," Patricia's voice carried that particular tone she used when she was being deliberately gracious. "I hope you're not too busy with your little shop." Even after 2 years of marriage, she still referred to my bookstore as my little shop, as if it were a hobby rather than a legitimate business. I'd learned to let these small slights roll off me, focusing instead on the fact that Julian loved me, and that should be enough. "Good morning, Patricia. How are you?" "Oh, wonderful. Thank you for asking. I'm actually calling with exciting news. Robert's sister Jennifer and her family will be joining us for Thanksgiving this year." "You remember Jennifer, don't you? She lives in that lovely estate in Westchester County." I did remember Jennifer Ashworth Montgomery, though we'd only met briefly at the wedding. She was everything Patricia wished she could be. Married to a hedge fund manager, living in a sprawling mansion, sending her children to elite private schools. She was also the family member who had made several pointed comments about new money versus old money, and how, quote, "some people don't understand the difference." "That's lovely," I replied, genuinely trying to sound enthusiastic. "It'll be nice to have a full family gathering." "Yes, well, that's actually what I wanted to discuss with you." Patricia's tone shifted slightly, becoming more businesslike. "Jennifer's husband Charles is quite discerning about the company he keeps. Very successful, you understand, moves in rather exclusive circles. I want to make sure we present the family in the best possible light." I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. "Of course. Is there anything specific you'd like me to bring? I make an excellent cranberry orange bread, or I could." "Oh, that's sweet, dear, but I have the menu completely planned. I was thinking more about, well, how you present yourself. Jennifer's family is accustomed to a certain level of sophistication. Perhaps you could wear something a bit more formal than usual, and maybe we could prepare some talking points about your background, your family's situation." The knot in my stomach tightened. My background? Well, you know how these things go. Charles is the type who likes to understand people's pedigree, their connections. It would be helpful if we could present your family history in the most favorable light possible. I set down the book I'd been holding, my hands suddenly feeling unsteady. "Patricia, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a sharp edge. "I'm asking you to help us avoid any awkward questions about your circumstances, Camille. Jennifer and Charles move in very wealthy circles, and they can be quite direct in their inquiries. It would be embarrassing for Julian if questions arose about how a bookstore owner from nowhere could afford some of the things you have." "The things I have?" I repeated, genuinely confused. "Come now, dear. That watch you wear isn't costume jewelry. Your shoes, your handbags. They're lovely, but they're not exactly what one would expect on a small business owner's budget. And then there's your education. Columbia University isn't inexpensive. People notice these inconsistencies." I looked down at my wrist, at the vintage Cartier watch that had been my grandmother's. I'd worn it every day for so long that I'd forgotten it might seem out of place to someone calculating the cost of my life against my supposed income. I have some nice things from college, from before I opened the store," I said, which was technically true. "And the watch was my grandmother's." "Of course it was," Patricia said, her tone suggesting she didn't believe me for a second. "Look, Camille, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm trying to protect Julian. You know how much his family's reputation means in this town. We've worked very hard to build our standing in the community." "I would never do anything to harm Julian's reputation," I said quietly. "I'm sure you wouldn't intentionally," she replied. "But you have to understand, there are already whispers. People wonder about your family, where you came from, how you can afford to live the way you live on what you supposedly earn. Jennifer and Charles are the type of people who won't just whisper, they'll ask direct questions." My chest felt tight. "What kind of questions?" "About your parents, your family's financial situation, how you funded your education, how you could afford to open a business in such a prime location. Charles has a way of investigating people he finds suspicious." The word suspicious hit me like a slap. "Patricia, are you suggesting that I'm not suggesting anything, dear. I'm simply saying that appearances matter. And right now, your appearances don't quite add up. For Julian's sake, it would be helpful if we could present a clearer picture of your background." I stood there in my beautiful bookstore, surrounded by thousands of stories, and realized I was living in one I'd never intended to write. The quiet life I'd built in Millbrook Heights suddenly felt fragile, like a house of cards that Patricia was threatening to blow down with one conversation. "What exactly do you want me to say?" I asked. "Just be prepared to explain yourself clearly. And perhaps dress more modestly. We don't want to give Jennifer and Charles the wrong impression about your expectations from this family." After we hung up, I sat in the reading nook by my front window, watching the autumn leaves fall onto Maple Street. For 3 years, I'd been playing a role, not maliciously, but out of a genuine desire to be normal. Now that role was becoming a trap. The truth was, I could buy Patricia's house, Jennifer's estate, and Charles's hedge fund without making a dent in my trust fund. But I'd wanted so desperately to be loved for who I was, not what I had, that I'd created a situation where the people I was trying to impress looked down on me for not having enough. Julian found me there an hour later, still staring out the window. "Hey, beautiful," he said, kissing the top of my head. "You look like you're thinking heavy thoughts." "Your mother called," I said simply. His expression shifted immediately. "What did she say?" I looked up at him, This wonderful, kind man who loved me completely and had no idea that his family's financial insecurities were about to collide with my hidden reality. "She wants to make sure I make a good impression on your aunt and uncle at Thanksgiving," I said, which was true, if incomplete. Julian frowned. "You always make a good impression. You're perfect." If only he knew how complicated perfect could be. "She's just worried about the family's reputation," I said. "She wants me to be prepared for questions about my background." "What kind of questions?" Julian's voice carried a protective edge that made my heart ache. I couldn't tell him the truth, that his mother suspected me of being a gold digger, that his family thought I was using him for financial gain. Not when the reality was so much more complicated than they could possibly imagine. "Just the usual getting-to-know-you questions," I said instead. "Where I'm from, what my family does, that sort of thing." Julian sat down beside me, taking my hands in his. "Camille, you know you can tell them anything you want about your family, right? Or nothing at all. Your past is your business." I squeezed his hands, loving him so much in that moment that it hurt. He was defending my right to privacy, not knowing that my privacy was about to become everyone's business. "I know," I whispered. "I love you. I love you too. And if my family can't see how incredible you are, that's their problem, not yours." But as I looked out at the street where I'd built my quiet, normal life, I had a sinking feeling that Thanksgiving dinner was going to be anything but quiet, and my normal life was about to get very complicated indeed. The invitation had been extended, the stage was set, and I had no idea how dramatically everything was about to change. The week leading up to Thanksgiving felt like preparing for a performance I'd never auditioned for. Every morning I'd catch myself staring at my closet, wondering which version of myself I was supposed to present to Julian's family. The woman who could afford anything but chose simplicity? The mysterious bookstore owner with no apparent family wealth? Or something in between that might satisfy Patricia's demand for clarity about my background? Julian noticed my distraction immediately. He'd find me standing in front of my jewelry box, holding different pieces and setting them down again, or staring blankly at my computer while supposedly updating the bookstore's inventory system. "You're overthinking this," he said on Tuesday evening, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I stood at our kitchen window. "It's just dinner with family. You've had dinner with my parents dozens of times, but not with Jennifer and Charles," I replied, leaning back against his chest. "Your mother made it sound like Charles is the type who investigates people for fun." Julian laughed, the vibration rumbling through his chest against my back. "Charles is pretentious, I'll give you that. But he's harmless. He just likes to feel important by knowing everyone's business. If he asks you anything that makes you uncomfortable, I'll shut it down." I turned in his arms, studying his face. Julian had always been my protector in small ways, steering conversations away from topics that made me uncomfortable, deflecting his parents' more pointed questions about my family, creating a buffer between me and the parts of his world that felt intrusive. But he had no idea what he might be protecting me from this time. What if he asks about my parents, my family's finances? You know I don't like talking about that stuff. "Then you don't have to," Julian said firmly. "You can tell him it's private, or you can change the subject, or you can excuse yourself to help my mother in the kitchen. You don't owe anyone your personal history, Camille, not even family." The irony wasn't lost on me. Julian was defending my right to privacy from his own relatives, while those relatives suspected me of hiding something that would hurt him. The truth was, I was hiding something, just not what they thought. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the bookstore. I was helping a customer find a cookbook for her daughter when the bell above the door chimed, and Jennifer Ashworth Montgomery walked in. She looked exactly as I remembered from the wedding, impeccably dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her blonde hair styled in a perfect bob, her makeup flawless despite having driven 3 hours from Westchester County. "Camille," she said, her voice carrying the same practiced warmth I remembered, "what a lovely little place you have here." The customer I'd been helping glanced between us, clearly sensing some undercurrent she couldn't identify, and quickly made her purchase before leaving us alone. "Jennifer, what a surprise," I said, genuinely startled by her unexpected appearance. "I thought you weren't arriving until tomorrow." "I came up early to do some shopping in Albany," she replied, though her eyes were already scanning my bookstore with what felt like professional assessment. "Charles is arriving tomorrow morning. I thought I'd stop by and see your establishment." She moved through the store like she was conducting an inventory, noting the quality of the fixtures, the expensive coffee machine, the carefully curated selection of rare and first-edition books I kept in a locked display case. I watched her mentally calculating costs, probably wondering how a small-town bookstore could afford such luxuries. "This must have required quite an investment," she said finally, pausing at the first-edition display. "Starting a business like this from scratch. These books alone must be worth." She trailed off, leaving the question hanging. "I was fortunate to find some good estate sales when I was getting started," I said, which was technically true. I had bought some of the books at estate sales, though I'd also purchased several directly from auction houses that specialized in rare literature. Jennifer nodded slowly, her expression giving nothing away. "And your apartment upstairs? Patricia mentioned it's quite charming. Did you renovate it yourself?" "I had some work done when I moved in," I admitted. The truth was, I'd had the entire space gutted and redesigned by an interior decorator who specialized in creating cozy, lived-in spaces that didn't scream money. It had cost more than most people spent on a house, but the result was a home that felt genuinely comfortable rather than ostentatious. "How resourceful of you," Jennifer said. "Not many people your age have the capital or the vision to create something like this. You must come from a very entrepreneurial family." There it was, the first probe. I could see her fishing for information, trying to understand how someone with my apparent background could have created what she was seeing. "My family encouraged independence," I said carefully. "They believed in working hard for what you want." "Of course," Jennifer replied. "Though I imagine they must have provided some guidance. Financial planning, business connections, that sort of thing. Starting a retail business in such a prime location, well, the real estate alone must have been substantial." I felt like I was walking through a minefield. Every answer I gave would be weighed against what she thought she knew about my circumstances, and every deflection would be noted as suspicious. "I was lucky to find a good location at the right time," I said, which was true. I'd also paid cash for the building and the renovation, but that wasn't information I was prepared to share. Jennifer spent another 20 minutes browsing, asking casual questions that felt anything but casual. Where had I gone to high school? What did my parents do for work? Had I always been interested in books, or was this a recent passion? Each question felt like a test, and I found myself giving answers that were true but incomplete, walking the line between honesty and privacy. After she left, I called my assistant manager, Tracy, and asked her to close the store early. I needed time to think, to prepare myself for what was clearly going to be more than a simple family dinner. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my actual family. "Camille!" My mother's voice was warm with surprise when she answered her phone. "Darling, how lovely to hear from you. It's been far too long." "Hi, Mom. How are you and Dad?" "Oh, we're wonderful. Just got back from the Phillips Collection Gala last night. You remember the Phillips family, don't you? Their daughter Penelope was asking about you. She said she heard you'd gotten married and moved somewhere upstate. We told her you were living your dream with that bookstore of yours." I smiled despite my anxiety. My parents had never fully understood my desire for a simple life, but they'd supported it in their own way. They sent me newspaper clippings about independent bookstores, asked about my inventory, and genuinely seemed proud that I'd built something on my own terms. "Mom, I need to ask you something," I said. "If someone were to investigate our family, what would they find?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Investigate? Darling, what's going on? Is everything all right? Everything's fine, Julian's family is having some people over for Thanksgiving who are apparently very interested in everyone's background. I wanted to be prepared. My mother laughed, the sound rich and familiar. Oh, honey, anyone who looks into the Delacroix family will find exactly what you'd expect. Old pharmaceutical money, charitable foundations, society pages from here to Boston. Your father's firm handles half the Fortune 500 companies in Manhattan. We're hardly mysterious. That's what I was afraid of, I murmured. Camille, my mother's voice became serious. Are you in some kind of trouble? Do you need us to? No, Mom, I'm fine. I've been keeping things simple up here. People don't know about the family money. Another pause. How simple? Very simple. Like, they think I'm a regular person who owns a bookstore. Oh, darling. My mother's voice was full of understanding now. You've been playing normal again, haven't you? It wasn't the first time I'd tried to escape my family's wealth and social position. In college, I'd gone by my middle name for 2 years, trying to make friends who didn't know about the trust fund. It had worked until my parents showed up for graduation in a limousine with a driver who called me Ms. Delacroix in front of my entire dormitory. What happens if they find out? I asked. Then they find out that you're one of the wealthiest young women in New York State, and they realize they've been worrying about the wrong person's financial motives, my mother said pragmatically. Is that really so terrible? When she put it that way, it sounded almost reasonable, but I knew it wasn't that simple. The revelation wouldn't just change how Julian's family saw me, it would change everything about the life I'd built in Millbrook Heights. I just wanted to be loved for who I am, not what I have, I said quietly. And you are, sweetheart. Julian loves you for exactly who you are. The money is just extra information. After I hung up, I sat in my living room, looking around at the home Julian and I had built together. Tomorrow, I would walk into his parents' house and face questions I'd been avoiding for 3 years. I could continue the performance, keep deflecting, and hoping they'd eventually lose interest. Or I could find a way to navigate the truth without destroying the life I'd come to love. What I didn't know was that the choice would soon be taken out of my hands entirely. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the kind of crisp, clear weather that made Millbrook Heights look like a postcard. Julian woke up early, humming while he made coffee, completely oblivious to the knots of anxiety that had kept me awake most of the night. I watched him move around our kitchen with easy confidence, and I envied his ability to approach family gatherings as simple, pleasant occasions rather than potential battlefields. You're going to love Charles once you get to know him, Julian said, buttering toast with the casual optimism that was one of his most endearing qualities. He's got some strong opinions, but he's actually pretty funny when he's not trying to impress people. I managed to smile while internally wondering if Charles would find me equally entertaining once he started asking his probing questions. What should I expect? Patricia made him sound rather intense. He's successful, so he likes talking about success. He's got opinions about everything from politics to wine to the stock market. But he's family, you know? He means well, even when he comes across as interrogating people. Julian's definition of meaning well and mine were about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. I'd spent an hour that morning choosing my outfit, finally settling on a navy blue cashmere sweater and tailored pants that were elegant but not flashy. I wore my grandmother's pearls, real, but not ostentatiously large, and her vintage Cartier watch, figuring that if anyone questioned them, I could honestly say they were family heirlooms. My wedding ring was the only other jewelry I wore, and I deliberately chose flats instead of the designer heels I normally preferred. The drive to Robert and Patricia's house took 15 minutes through tree-lined streets decorated with the kind of autumn splendor that made tourists flock to New England. Julian reached over and squeezed my hand as we turned into his parents' circular driveway. "Hey," he said softly, If anyone makes you uncomfortable today, just give me a look and I'll rescue you, okay? I squeezed back, loving him fiercely in that moment. Okay. The Ashworth house was a beautiful colonial that spoke of old New England prosperity without being ostentatious. It was the kind of house that impressed people in Millbrook Heights while remaining modest by Manhattan standards, which was exactly the kind of perspective that was going to get me in trouble today. Patricia answered the door wearing an apron over what was clearly an expensive dress, playing the role of the gracious hostess who'd been cooking all morning. The reality, I knew from previous holidays, was that she'd hired caterers and spent the morning arranging store-bought dishes on her own serving platters. "Camille, dear," she air-kissed my cheek, "don't you look lovely? Very appropriate." The word appropriate felt loaded with meaning I didn't want to unpack. "Thank you for having us," I replied, handing her the bottle of wine Julian and I had brought, a nice but not exceptional vintage that had cost about $60. I'd specifically avoided bringing anything from my family's wine collection, which included bottles worth more than most people's cars. Robert emerged from his study, shaking Julian's hand and giving me a polite nod. "Camille, good to see you. How's business at the bookstore?" "Very good, thank you. The holiday season always brings in more customers." "I imagine it does," he said, though his tone suggested he had opinions about the viability of independent bookstores that he was keeping to himself for now. Jennifer and Charles arrived 20 minutes later in a black Mercedes that probably cost more than Julian made in 2 years. Charles was exactly as I remembered him. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of making million-dollar decisions. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that managed to look casual while undoubtedly costing thousands of dollars. "Julian!" Charles clasped my husband's shoulder with genuine warmth. "Good to see you, nephew." "And Camille?" He turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The mysterious bookstore owner. I've been looking forward to getting to know you better." The word mysterious felt deliberate, like he'd already discussed me with Jennifer and Patricia. "It's wonderful to see you again, Charles," I replied, accepting his firm handshake. "Jennifer told me you drove up from the city. How was the traffic?" "Not bad for a holiday weekend. We took the scenic route through some charming little towns. It's amazing how different life is outside Manhattan, isn't it? So much more simple." There was something in his tone that made simple sound like a judgment rather than an observation. The first hour of the gathering unfolded with the careful choreography of upper-middle-class entertaining. Appetizers were served, drinks were poured, and conversation flowed through safe topics: the weather, local news, Julian's business plans. I began to relax slightly, thinking that perhaps I'd overthought the situation. Then Charles refilled his scotch and settled into what was clearly his preferred role as the family's lead questioner. "So, Camille," he began, swirling his drink with practiced casualness, "I have to say, I'm impressed by what you've accomplished with your bookstore. Independent retail is such a challenging market these days. You must have had excellent guidance to make it work so well." Here we go, I thought. Thank you. I've been fortunate. Fortunate indeed. The real estate market in downtown Millbrook Heights has become quite competitive, hasn't it? Prime locations like yours don't come cheap. His smile remained friendly, but his eyes were calculating. You must have had quite a bit of capital to invest, or perhaps family backing? Julian shifted beside me, and I could feel his protective instincts beginning to activate. "Camille worked incredibly hard to save up for the store," he said firmly. "She's been passionate about books her entire life." "Oh, I don't doubt her passion," Charles replied smoothly. "But passion alone doesn't usually cover commercial real estate, renovation costs, initial inventory, and living expenses during those crucial first months." The numbers must have been substantial. Patricia had gone very still, clearly hanging on every word. Jennifer was watching me with the focused attention of someone waiting for a performance to begin. I was careful with my finances, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I saved for several years before making the move. Saved from what, exactly? Charles leaned forward slightly. If you don't mind me asking, what did you do before opening the bookstore? Your education suggests you could have pursued much more lucrative career paths. The room felt like it was holding its breath. This was the moment I'd been dreading. The direct question I couldn't deflect without seeming evasive. I worked in publishing for a few years after college, I said, which was technically true. I'd done a summer internship at a literary magazine during college, though I'd never needed to work for money. Publishing, Charles nodded thoughtfully. That's interesting. Which company? I have some connections in that industry. Perhaps we know some of the same people. My mouth felt dry. Charles clearly knew people throughout New York's business world, and if I named a specific company, he might very well know someone there who could contradict my story. It was a small literary magazine, I said vaguely. Nothing you would have heard of. Try me, Charles smiled, but his eyes had grown sharper. I've been involved in media investments for 20 years. I know most of the players in New York publishing, even the smaller ones. Julian's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently. He was trying to be supportive, but I could feel his confusion about why I was being so evasive about something as simple as a previous job. Charles, Patricia interjected with artificial lightness, perhaps we should save the career discussions for after dinner. I'm sure Camille would rather talk about something more pleasant. But Charles was clearly enjoying himself now, sensing that he'd found a weak spot. Oh, I think careers are fascinating, especially unconventional ones. It takes real courage to leave a stable job in publishing to open a bookstore in a small town, though I imagine the financial transition must have been challenging. We managed just fine, Julian said, his voice carrying a slight edge now. I'm sure you did, Charles replied, though Camille's background does raise some interesting questions about how exactly one manages such a transition. The lifestyle choices, the investment in quality fixtures and inventory, the prime real estate. It suggests either exceptional financial planning or access to resources that aren't immediately apparent. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jennifer was now smiling openly, clearly pleased with her husband's performance. Patricia looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. Robert was studying his drink as if it contained the secrets of the universe. And Julian was staring at Charles with growing anger. What exactly are you trying to say, Uncle Charles? Julian's voice was calm, but I recognized the warning tone that meant he was reaching the end of his patience. Charles raised his hands in a gesture of innocence. I'm not trying to say anything, Julian. I'm simply making conversation, getting to know your lovely wife better. Though I have to admit, her background does seem rather carefully curated, almost as if she's trying to present a particular image rather than simply being herself. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Charles had just essentially called me a fraud in front of my husband and his entire family, and he'd done it with such smooth sophistication that it almost sounded like a compliment. I felt my carefully constructed normal life beginning to crack around the edges, and I realized that no amount of preparation could have readied me for this moment. The first real battle had begun, and I was already losing ground. The silence that followed Charles's accusations stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my response to his carefully worded challenge. Julian's hand had tightened around mine, and I could practically hear his internal struggle between defending me and trying to understand why I seemed so uncomfortable with simple questions about my past. Charles, Jennifer said with false sweetness, you're being so thorough, but I think what you're really asking is quite reasonable. We all just want to understand Camille's story better. After all, she's family now. The way she said family made it sound like a privilege I hadn't earned, rather than a relationship I'd entered through love and marriage. Exactly, Charles continued, apparently encouraged by his wife's support. And speaking of family, Camille, I'm curious about yours. You've been remarkably quiet about your parents, your siblings, your background. Most people love talking about where they come from." Patricia leaned forward slightly, her earlier discomfort replaced by obvious interest. This was clearly the conversation she'd been hoping for, the one where all her suspicions would finally be confirmed. "My family is very private," I said carefully. "They prefer to stay out of the spotlight." Charles laughed, a sound that was more calculating than amused. "The spotlight? In Millbrook Heights? Come now, Camille, we're hardly talking about paparazzi here. Surely you can tell us what your parents do for work, where you grew up, that sort of basic information." Julian shifted in his chair, his protective instincts fully activated now. "She doesn't have to justify anything to anyone," he said firmly. "Camille's personal history is her business." "Of course it is," Charles agreed smoothly. "But you have to admit, Julian, it's unusual for someone to be so secretive about such ordinary things. Unless, of course, they're not ordinary at all." The implication in his voice was unmistakable. He was suggesting that I was either hiding something shameful or lying about my circumstances entirely. "What exactly are you implying?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt inside. Charles set down his scotch and leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying his role as the family's chief investigator. "I'm not implying anything, my dear. I'm simply observing inconsistencies. You claim to have worked in publishing, but you're vague about which company. You say you saved money to open your bookstore, but the level of investment suggests resources far beyond what a publishing assistant could accumulate. You present yourself as someone from modest means, yet you own rare books worth thousands of dollars, wear vintage jewelry that would make collectors weep, and somehow manage to purchase prime commercial real estate in cash." My blood ran cold. "How do you know I paid cash?" Charles smiled triumphantly. "I have a friend in commercial real estate who handles properties throughout the Hudson Valley. Curious man that I am, I asked him to look into the sale of your building. Imagine my surprise when he told me it was purchased outright by something called the DLR Trust for nearly $500,000, no mortgage required." The room went completely silent. Even Robert looked up from his drink, clearly startled by this revelation. Patricia's eyes were wide with vindication. This was exactly what she'd suspected all along. Julian turned to look at me, confusion and concern warring in his expression. "Camille? What's he talking about?" I felt trapped, like an animal caught in headlights. The DLR Trust was one of several financial instruments my family used to manage their assets discreetly. The letters stood for Delacroix Legacy Revocable, a detail that Charles probably hadn't uncovered yet, but would if he kept digging. I had some help with the purchase," I said weakly. "Help from whom?" Charles pressed, leaning forward like a shark sensing blood in the water. "This mysterious family you won't discuss? The ones who are so private they apparently prefer to funnel money through anonymous trusts, rather than simply co-signing a loan like normal parents?" Jennifer was practically glowing with satisfaction. "It does seem rather elaborate for a simple family helping their daughter start a business, doesn't it?" Patricia found her voice at last. "Camille, I think we all deserve an explanation. We've welcomed you into this family, and now we discover that you've been misleading us about your circumstances." "I haven't misled anyone," I protested, though even I could hear how unconvincing it sounded. "Haven't you?" Charles stood up, beginning to pace like a lawyer delivering a closing argument. "You've presented yourself as a hard-working young woman who saved up to follow her dreams. Meanwhile, you're funding major business ventures through anonymous trusts, wearing jewelry worth more than most people's cars, and living a lifestyle that would be impossible on a bookstore owner's income." Julian was staring at me now, and I could see the pieces starting to click together in his mind. 3 years of small inconsistencies were suddenly forming a pattern he'd been too trusting to see before. "The watch," he said quietly. "You said it was your grandmother's." "It is," I said desperately. "And the books in your rare collection. You said you found them at estate sales. Some of them I did. And the renovation of the apartment. You said you had some work done. I closed my eyes, knowing how this must sound to him. Every truth I'd told had been incomplete, every explanation carefully crafted to avoid revealing the larger reality. Charles was clearly delighted by Julian's dawning understanding. You see what I mean, Julian? Your wife has been very creative with the truth. The question is why? What is she really hiding? That's enough, Julian said sharply, standing up to face his uncle. Whatever Camille's reasons for privacy, she's my wife and I trust her completely. Do you? Charles challenged. Because from where I sit, it looks like she's been playing a very careful game for 3 years. A young woman with mysterious resources marries into a well-established local family, maintains a humble facade while living well beyond her apparent means, and refuses to discuss her background with anyone. If I didn't know better, I'd say she was a gold digger who got caught. The words hit the air like a physical blow. Patricia gasped audibly. Jennifer's smile became predatory, and Robert looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair entirely. But Julian looked like he'd been slapped. How dare you, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. How dare you sit in my parents' house and accuse my wife of being a gold digger? I'm not accusing her of anything, Charles replied with infuriating calmness. I'm simply pointing out facts. She has significant financial resources that she's hidden from your family. She's been deliberately vague about her background. And she's clearly not who she's pretended to be. Those are just observable realities. The reality, Julian said, his voice rising, is that you're a pompous ass who thinks his money gives him the right to interrogate people at family dinners. Julian, Patricia exclaimed, shocked by her son's language. But Charles just smiled wider. I understand you're defensive, Julian. No one likes to think they've been deceived by someone they love. But ask yourself this. If Camille has nothing to hide, why won't she simply tell us where her money comes from? All eyes turned to me again. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that whatever I said next would either save me or send me tumbling into an abyss that would destroy everything I'd built in Millbrook Heights. Because, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, it's complicated. Charles laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth. Complicated? How wonderfully vague. Let me guess. It's a family trust, isn't it? Old money that you're embarrassed about? Or perhaps new money that comes from sources you'd rather not discuss? He was getting closer to the truth with every guess, and we both knew it. Actually, Jennifer chimed in, clearly unable to resist joining the attack, I did some research of my own after visiting your bookstore yesterday. It's amazing what you can find with the right connections and a little curiosity. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. I have a friend who works in estate law in Manhattan, Jennifer continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She specializes in high-net-worth families, trusts, and inheritance planning. When I described your situation, young woman, significant but mysterious resources, expensive tastes hidden behind a modest facade, she said it sounded exactly like someone trying to escape a wealthy family background. The room was spinning. They were so close to the truth that I could feel my carefully constructed life crumbling around me. So here's my question, Camille, Charles said, moving in for what he clearly thought would be the killing blow. Are you running from money or running toward it? Because either way, you've been lying to this family for 3 years, and I think Julian deserves to know who he really married. The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. I looked around the room at faces that ranged from triumphant to confused to heartbroken, and realized that there was no way to deflect or redirect this conversation anymore. The truth was about to come out, whether I wanted it to or not. I sat frozen in my chair, feeling like a defendant in a trial I'd never signed up for. The faces around the table were a mixture of accusation, disappointment, and confusion. Charles stood over me like a prosecutor, delivering his final argument, while Jennifer watched with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped orchestrate my downfall. Patricia's expression had shifted from suspicion to something approaching vindication. Finally, her instincts about me were being proven correct. But it was Julian's face that broke my heart. The man who had defended me so fiercely just moments before was now staring at me with growing realization that 3 years of our life together contained mysteries he'd never suspected. I could see him mentally reviewing every conversation we'd had about money, every time I'd deflected questions about my family, every moment when I'd been vague about my past. "Well," Charles prompted, clearly savoring what he believed was his moment of triumph. "Are you going to continue with the mysterious act? Or are you finally going to tell this family the truth about who you really are?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. How could I explain that I wasn't the gold digger they suspected, but rather someone who had more money than all of them combined? How could I make them understand that every lie I'd told had been in service of trying to live an authentic life, free from the expectations and assumptions that came with my family name? "Camille," Julian said quietly, his voice full of a pain that cut through me like a knife, "please, just tell me the truth. Whatever it is, we can work through it. But I need to know who I'm married to." The way he said it, as if he'd discovered he was married to a stranger, made my chest tighten with panic. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of for 3 years. Not that someone would discover I had money, but that the revelation would make Julian question everything about our relationship. Everything about me. I started, then stopped. The truth felt impossibly large and complicated to explain in this hostile environment, surrounded by people who had already decided I was some kind of con artist. Jennifer leaned forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "It's interesting, isn't it, how difficult it seems to be for you to give a straight answer? Most people can explain their background in a few sentences. Where they grew up, what their parents do, how they afford their lifestyle. But you act like these are state secrets." "Maybe they are," Charles added with a laugh that held no warmth. "Maybe our mysterious Camille has been hiding more than just family money. Maybe she's been hiding the kind of family money that comes with conditions or obligations, or sources that aren't entirely legitimate." Julian whipped around to face his uncle. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "I'm just saying that people who are this secretive about their wealth usually have good reasons," Charles replied with a shrug. "Legal reasons, ethical reasons, family reputation reasons. The question is, what kind of family legacy is she so desperate to hide from?" I felt like I was drowning. Every attempt at explanation would only fuel more speculation, more accusations. They had taken my desire for privacy and twisted it into evidence of criminality or deception. "Stop," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "Just stop." But Charles was on a roll now, energized by what he perceived as my weakness. "You know what I think, Julian? I think your wife comes from the kind of money that makes people ask uncomfortable questions. Maybe organized crime, maybe political corruption, maybe just old-fashioned exploitation. Why else would someone go to such lengths to hide their family connections?" "That's enough!" Julian exploded, slamming his hand on the table hard enough to make the wine glasses jump. "You don't get to sit here and accuse my wife of being connected to criminal activity based on nothing but your own paranoid speculation." But even as he defended me, I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. Charles's accusations were so wild that they should have been easy to dismiss, but my continued silence was making them seem plausible by default. Patricia finally found her voice, though it shook with emotion. "Camille, honey, please, we're family. Whatever this is about, we can handle it. But this secrecy is tearing us apart. Julian has the right to know who he married, and we have the right to know who we've welcomed into our family." The word "welcomed" hung in the air with bitter irony. From the moment I'd met the Ashworths, I'd felt like I was on probation, constantly being evaluated and found wanting. Now I understood why. they'd been waiting for exactly this moment, when their suspicions would be confirmed and they could justify their coldness toward me. "We've been nothing but kind to you," Patricia continued, her voice gaining strength. "We included you in family traditions. We supported your business. We never asked for anything but honesty. And this is how you repay us? With lies and evasion and whatever this charade has been about?" Robert, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should all take a step back here. This is getting out of hand." "Is it?" Charles challenged his brother-in-law. "Because I think this is exactly the kind of conversation this family should have had 3 years ago, before Julian got in so deep with someone whose entire identity appears to be fabricated." Julian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You know what? I've had enough of this. Camille, we're leaving." "No," I said quietly, surprising everyone, including myself. "We're not." Julian stared at me in confusion. "What?" I looked around the table at these people who had spent the last hour systematically dismantling my life, who had taken my desire for privacy and turned it into evidence of moral failure. Something inside me shifted, a gear clicking into place that I hadn't even realized was there. I said, "We're not leaving," I repeated, my voice steadier now. "Because you're all so determined to know the truth about me, and I'm tired of pretending that your assumptions matter more than reality." Charles practically preened. "Finally, some honesty." "Oh, you want honesty?" I stood up slowly, feeling something fundamental change in my posture, in my voice, in the way I held myself. For 3 years, I'd been making myself smaller, quieter, more modest than I naturally was. For 3 years, I'd been trying to fit into their expectations of who I should be. I was done with that. "You want to know about my family, Charles? You want to know where my money comes from?" I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving with swift precision. "Let me make a call." "Camille, what are you doing?" Julian asked, confusion evident in his voice. I didn't answer him. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for, then pressed call. The phone barely rang once before it was answered. "Miss Delacroix?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and immediately recognizable to me as the voice of someone trained in security and protection services. The silence around the table was absolute. Even Charles had gone completely still. "Yes," I said, my voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there moments before. "I need you to come to 847 Elmwood Drive in Millbrook Heights. There's been a situation." "Immediately, Miss Delacroix. How many?" "Just you. And Thomas, when you get here, please make sure to use my full name when you address me. These people seem very interested in understanding exactly who I am." I hung up the phone and looked around the table at faces that had gone from triumphant to confused to something approaching alarm. "He'll be here in 15 minutes, I said calmly, sitting back down and folding my hands in my lap. "I suggest we use that time wisely, because once he arrives, this conversation is going to take a very different turn." Julian was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. "Camille, who did you just call?" I looked at my husband, this man I loved more than I'd ever loved anyone, who was about to learn that the woman he'd married was someone entirely different from who he thought she was. "I called my bodyguard," I said simply. "Thomas has been on standby about an hour away ever since I told my family I might need backup for Thanksgiving dinner." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting down the minutes until my carefully constructed normal life came to an end forever. The 15 minutes that followed my phone call felt like the longest quarter hour of my life. Nobody seemed to know what to say or do. Charles had lost his prosecutorial swagger and kept glancing toward the front windows as if expecting an army to arrive. Jennifer sat rigid in her chair, her earlier confidence replaced by obvious nervousness. Patricia fidgeted with her napkin, while Robert had gone back to studying his drink as if it contained answers to questions he didn't want to ask. Julian hadn't taken his eyes off me since I'd hung up the phone. I could see him trying to reconcile the woman he'd married, quiet, modest, private, with the person who had just summoned a bodyguard with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having security at their disposal. "Camille," he said carefully, "when you say bodyguard, you mean—" "I mean a trained security professional who has been responsible for my safety since I was 16 years old," I replied, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "Thomas spent 12 years with the Secret Service before my family hired him. He's very good at his job." The words hung in the air like a foreign language. The Ashworths lived in a world where the most security anyone needed was a burglar alarm and maybe a doorbell camera. The concept of personal protection was so far outside their experience that they seemed unable to process what I was telling them. "Why," Julian asked slowly, "would you need a bodyguard?" Before I could answer, Charles found his voice again, though it lacked its earlier confidence. "What kind of family requires that level of security for their children?" I looked at him steadily. "The kind of family that appears on Forbes lists. The kind whose charitable foundations are named after them on hospital wings and university buildings. The kind that owns pharmaceutical companies, real estate portfolios, and art collections that get loaned to major museums." Patricia's napkins slipped from her fingers. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that for the past 3 years you've been calling me a gold digger while having no idea who I actually am," I replied. "I'm saying that while you've been worried about me taking advantage of your son's modest family wealth, I've been hiding the fact that my trust fund generates more money in a month than this entire family makes in a year." The silence was deafening. Charles opened his mouth, then closed it again without speaking. Jennifer had gone pale, clearly calculating how badly she had miscalculated the situation. Julian shook his head slowly, as if trying to clear it. "I don't understand. If you have that much money, why were you living above a bookstore? Why were you pretending to be someone else?" And there it was, the question I'd been dreading for 3 years, the one that would either save my marriage or destroy it completely. "Because," I said, my voice breaking slightly, "I wanted someone to love me for who I am, not what I have. I wanted a normal life, a real relationship, a chance to be valued for something other than my family's money." "So you lied to me," Julian said quietly. "For 3 years you lied to me about who you are." The pain in his voice was like a physical blow. "I never lied to you about who I am, Julian. I am exactly the person you fell in love with. I love books. I believe in the power of stories to change people's lives. I want to build something meaningful with my own hands. The money doesn't change any of that. Doesn't it?" Patricia found her voice, though it shook with emotion. "You sat at our table for 3 years, letting us worry about whether you were good enough for our son, while knowing you could buy and sell this entire family 100 times over. How is that not deception?" I felt tears starting to sting my eyes. "Because I never wanted your money, Patricia. I never wanted anything from any of you except acceptance. I wanted to be part of a normal family, to have Sunday dinners and holiday traditions and people who cared about me for reasons that had nothing to do with my bank account." "But you made us the fools," Charles said, his voice bitter now. "You let us interrogate you, question your worthiness, when all along you were slumming it with the poor relatives. That's not what I was doing." I stood up again, anger flaring through my chest. I was trying to build a life where my value as a person wasn't determined by my great-grandfather's pharmaceutical patents. I was trying to find love that wasn't contaminated by financial calculations, by lying, Julian repeated, his voice flat, by pretending to be someone you're not. I stared at my husband, this man I'd loved completely and honestly, and realized that despite all my fears about gold diggers and financial manipulation, I'd never considered that he might feel betrayed by my wealth rather than attracted to it. "Julian," I said softly, "I'm the same person who recommended books to you in my store. I'm the same person who cried when we read the same novel and loved the same passages. I'm the same person who wanted to build a life with you based on shared dreams and genuine love. The money is just background noise." "Background noise?" Julian laughed, but there was no humor in it. Camille, you've been living a double life. You've been making me feel guilty about not being able to afford expensive restaurants while you could have bought the entire restaurant chain. You've been letting my parents question whether you're worthy of our family while knowing you come from more wealth than we could imagine. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the tension like a blade, and everyone froze. Through the front window, I could see a black SUV parked in the driveway, discreet but unmistakably expensive, with tinted windows and the kind of understated presence that screamed professional security. "That would be Thomas," I said quietly. Patricia stared at me in horror. "You actually called a bodyguard to our Thanksgiving dinner?" "I called someone I trust to witness whatever comes next," I replied. "Because this conversation has made it clear that this family will never accept me for who I really am, whether they think I'm too poor or too rich for their standards." The doorbell rang again, and I could see Thomas's silhouette through the frosted glass panel beside the door. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that probably cost more than Robert's monthly mortgage payment. "Are you going to answer that?" I asked, "or should I?" Robert stood up uncertainly, clearly out of his depth. I'll get it." As he walked toward the front door, I turned back to Julian one last time. "I love you," I said simply. "I've loved you since the day you walked into my bookstore, looking for something to read while your car was being repaired. I've loved you through every Sunday dinner with your parents, every holiday gathering, every moment when I had to bite my tongue while they questioned my worthiness to be part of this family." Julian's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "But you never trusted me enough to tell me the truth." "I was scared," I admitted. "I was scared that if you knew who I really was, you'd see me differently, that you'd wonder if you really loved me or just the idea of me, that every gift I gave you, every surprise, every gesture, would be tainted by questions about whether it was genuine affection or just me throwing money at problems." From the front hall I could hear Robert's voice, nervous and uncertain. Hello, you must be Thomas?" "Good evening, sir," came the reply in a deep professional voice. "I'm here for Miss Delacroix. Is she available?" The use of my family name sent a visible shock through everyone in the dining room. Charles actually flinched, as if he'd been slapped. "Miss Delacroix," Patricia repeated faintly. As in the Delacroix Pharmaceutical Foundation," I said quietly. "As in the Delacroix wing of Mount Sinai Hospital. As in the family that endowed the Delacroix Chair of Literature at Columbia University." Julian was staring at me like I'd revealed myself to be an alien from another planet. "You're that Delacroix family?" I nodded, feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified to finally have the truth out in the open. Thomas appeared in the doorway to the dining room, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was exactly as I'd expected. Impeccably dressed, professionally alert, and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who could handle any situation that might arise. "Miss Delacroix," he said, his voice carrying the respectful formality I'd grown up with, "I understand there's been some confusion about your identity this evening." I looked around the table one last time at the faces of people I'd hoped would become my family, people I'd genuinely cared about despite their suspicions and coldness. Now they stared back at me with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment to something that looked almost like fear. "No, Thomas," I said, standing up and smoothing down my sweater. "There's been no confusion. These people know exactly who I am now. The question is whether that changes anything." I looked at Julian, my heart breaking as I saw the answer written clearly on his face. He was looking at me like I was a stranger, like the past 3 years had been an elaborate performance rather than the most genuine relationship of my life. "I think," I said quietly, "it's time for me to go home." I walked out of the Ashworth house with my head held high, Thomas falling into step beside me with the practiced ease of someone who had escorted me away from uncomfortable situations before. The November air was sharp against my face, and I could hear the murmur of shocked voices still echoing from the dining room behind us. "The apartment above the bookstore, Miss Delacroix?" Thomas asked as he opened the passenger door of the SUV. Yes, please, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt inside. As the house disappeared behind us, I could see Julian's silhouette in the front window, watching us drive away. Part of me wanted to ask Thomas to turn around, to go back and try once more to make Julian understand. But the larger part of me knew that the damage was done, not just from tonight's revelations, but from 3 years of choices that had led us to this moment. The drive to downtown Millbrook Heights took 12 minutes. 12 minutes of silence during which my entire life seemed to rearrange itself around the reality that I was no longer Julian's wife in any meaningful sense, no longer a member of the Ashworth family, no longer the quiet bookstore owner who had built a normal life in a small town. Would you like me to remain on site tonight, Miss Delacroix? Thomas asked as we pulled up in front of my building. That won't be necessary, I said. But Thomas, thank you for coming so quickly and for reminding me who I am. He nodded with the kind of professional understanding that came from years of working with wealthy families and their complicated dynamics. Of course, Miss Delacroix. I'll be staying at the Hampton Inn if you need anything. The apartment felt different when I walked into it, smaller somehow, as if the revelation of my true identity had somehow changed the physical space around me. These rooms that had been my sanctuary for 3 years now felt like a stage set for a play that had just ended its run. I was still wearing my carefully chosen Thanksgiving outfit, still carrying the purse I'd selected to look appropriate but not expensive. Looking at myself in the hallway mirror, I realized how much energy I'd spent over the years calibrating my appearance, my words, my entire presence, to fit into a world that had never really wanted me anyway. My phone started ringing almost immediately. The first call was from my mother, which wasn't surprising. My parents kept tabs on my security detail, and Thomas would have reported the situation as soon as he received my call. Darling, my mother's voice was full of concern. Thomas said there was some kind of family emergency. Are you all right? I'm fine, Mom, I said, sinking onto my sofa, the same sofa where Julian and I had spent countless evenings reading together, where we'd planned our future, where we'd dreamed about the life we were going to build. The secret's out, that's all. Oh, honey, my mother's voice softened with understanding. What happened? I told her everything. Charles's investigation, the accusations of gold digging, Julian's hurt and confusion when he realized I'd been hiding my identity. My mother listened without interrupting, making the occasional sympathetic sound that mothers make when their children are in pain. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, she said when I finished. I know how much you wanted that normal life to work. Did I do the wrong thing? I asked, voicing the question that had been gnawing at me since I'd walked out of the Ashworth house. Should I have told Julian the truth from the beginning? My mother was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, she said finally, but I know why you didn't, after what happened with Benjamin. Benjamin. My ex-fiancé from 5 years ago, the one who had seemed so perfect until I discovered he'd been photographing us together for his social media accounts, using our relationship to build his personal brand and attract investors for his startup. The one who had proposed with a ring that cost less than he'd spent on the photographer he'd hired to capture the moment for his Instagram feed. This is different, I said weakly. Julian isn't Benjamin. He never cared about money or status or any of that. No, my mother agreed. But he cares about honesty. And unfortunately, darling, the 2 things you wanted most, genuine love and privacy about your wealth, were probably incompatible from the start. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, not bothering to turn on the lights. Outside, Maple Street was quiet, except for the occasional car driving past, families probably heading home from their own Thanksgiving dinners that had hopefully gone better than mine. The second call came an hour later. Julian. I stared at his name on my phone screen for 3 rings before answering. Camille. His voice was rough, like he'd been crying or shouting or both. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." "Not over the phone. Can I come over?" I closed my eyes, trying to imagine that conversation. Julian in our apartment, surrounded by the life we'd built together, trying to process the fact that every financial worry he'd ever shared with me, every time he'd apologized for not being able to afford something nicer, every moment when he'd felt inadequate about providing for our future, all of it had been happening while I sat on a fortune that could have solved every problem he'd ever worried about. "I don't think that's a good idea tonight," I said gently. "Camille, please, I need to understand, why didn't you trust me? In 3 years of marriage, why couldn't you trust me with the truth?" The pain in his voice broke my heart all over again. It wasn't about not trusting you, Julian. It was about being scared that the truth would change everything between us. "Well, it has anyway, hasn't it?" His laugh was bitter. "The irony is that you were so worried about me loving you for your money that you made it impossible for me to love you despite it." I didn't know how to respond to that. He was right, in a way that cut deeper than any of Charles's accusations had. "My family wants to know if you're planning to sue us," Julian continued, his voice flat. "For defamation or harassment or whatever rich people sue middle-class families for when they get insulted at dinner parties." "Julian, I would never." "Wouldn't you?" he interrupted. "Because honestly, Camille, I don't know what you would or wouldn't do anymore. I don't know who you are." The line went quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing, could picture him in his childhood bedroom at his parents' house, probably staring at the ceiling like he used to do when we had arguments and he needed time to think. "The bookstore," he said finally. "Is any of it real? Your love for books? Your passion for the community? The way you light up when you talk about connecting readers with stories? Is any of that actually you? Or is it all just part of the performance?" "How can you ask me that?" I whispered. "You know me, Julian. You've seen me with customers. You've watched me stay up until midnight reading manuscripts from local authors. You've listened to me talk about books for hours. That's not performance. That's who I am. But who you are also includes being one of the wealthiest women in New York State," he said. "And that's not exactly a minor detail to leave out of a marriage, is it?" The third call came after midnight, and it wasn't from anyone in Julian's family. It was from my lawyer. "Camille," David's voice was crisp and professional despite the late hour. "I've been contacted by a Charles Montgomery regarding some kind of incident at a family gathering tonight. He's making some concerning statements about his intentions to investigate your family's business dealings." I sat up straighter on my sofa. "What kind of statements?" "He seems to believe that your reluctance to discuss your background indicates some kind of criminal activity or corruption. He's mentioned hiring a private investigator to look into the Delacroix family's, quote, questionable business practices and, quote, suspicious wealth. I wanted to make you aware before this goes any further." Charles wasn't done with me. Even after learning that his accusations had been completely backwards, he was still trying to find ways to prove that I was somehow the villain in this story. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "I recommend that you let me handle it," David said firmly. "Charles Montgomery is a small-town hedge fund manager with delusions of importance. He has no idea what he's threatening to take on, and a few phone calls from my office should convince him to redirect his energy elsewhere." After David hung up, I finally understood something that had been nagging at me all evening. The Ashworth family's reaction to learning about my wealth hadn't been shame or embarrassment about their accusations, it had been resentment. They were angry at me for making them feel foolish, angry at me for disrupting their comfortable assumptions about social hierarchy, angry at me for being something other than what they decided I was. They hadn't wanted the truth. They'd wanted validation of their prejudices. And Julian was angry at me for not trusting him with a secret that would have fundamentally changed our entire relationship from day one. I looked around my apartment one more time at the life I'd built in service of a dream that had turned out to be impossible. You couldn't have genuine love based on incomplete truth, but you also couldn't have authentic relationships when your bank account was the most interesting thing about you. Tomorrow, I realized, I was going to have to figure out how to be Camille Delacroix again. The question was whether there was anything left of the person I'd been trying to be, or if she'd been lost somewhere between the accusations and the revelations of this terrible, life-changing evening. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by my bedroom window watching the sun rise over Millbrook Heights, thinking about patterns I'd been too close to see before. For 3 years, I'd been so focused on hiding my wealth that I'd never really examined why I felt the need to hide it in the first place. The truth was more complicated than simply wanting to be loved for myself. I'd been running from the assumption that money defined me, but in doing so, I'd allowed money to define me anyway, just in reverse. Every choice I'd made, from the modest clothes to the careful deflections about my family, had been shaped by my wealth, just as much as if I'd been flaunting it. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was making coffee in my kitchen when I heard footsteps on the external stairs that led to my apartment. Through the window, I saw Patricia climbing toward my door, moving slowly as if each step required considerable effort. I opened the door before she could knock. She looked like she'd aged 5 years overnight. Her hair less perfectly styled than usual, her makeup minimal, her expensive clothes replaced by a simple sweater and jeans that made her look more human than I'd ever seen her. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. I stepped aside, gesturing her toward the living room. She moved through my apartment like she was seeing it for the first time, taking in details she'd apparently missed during previous visits. The quality of the hardwood floors, the expensive but understated furniture, the original artwork on the walls that I now realized must look very different to someone who understood their actual value. "I owe you an apology," Patricia said, settling onto my sofa with a heavy sigh. "Several apologies, actually." I poured 2 cups of coffee, using the good china I'd bought but rarely used because it seemed too formal for everyday life. Another small irony. I'd been hiding luxury items in plain sight, afraid to seem too fancy for my supposed circumstances. "Patricia," I began, but she held up a hand to stop me. "Please, let me say this." She accepted the coffee cup with hands that weren't quite steady. "For 3 years I've been suspicious of you. Not because of anything you did or said, but because of who I am. Because I've spent my entire adult life in a social circle where everyone's constantly measuring everyone else's worth, where every friendship is complicated by questions of status and money and who has what." She paused, staring into her coffee cup. "I projected all of that onto you? I assumed you were calculating and manipulative because that's the world I know. I couldn't imagine that someone might actually want to step away from wealth and privilege because I've spent my whole life trying to climb toward it." I sat down across from her, trying to process this version of Patricia, vulnerable and self-aware in ways I'd never seen before. "When Robert and I first got married," she continued, "we were the young couple trying to prove we belonged in Millbrook Heights society. We worked so hard to fit in, to have the right house and join the right clubs and send Julian to the right schools. We built our entire identity around being respectable, established, worthy of respect. Patricia, and then you came along," she said with a sad smile. "Beautiful, educated, sophisticated, but apparently without the family connections or money that usually go with those qualities. You were everything I'd worked to become, but you seemed to have achieved it effortlessly, naturally. It made me feel inadequate, I suppose. Like maybe all my striving and status-seeking had been unnecessary." I stared at her, beginning to understand dynamics that had been invisible to me for years. "So when Charles started asking questions about your background, I encouraged it. When Jennifer suggested you might be hiding something, I wanted to believe it. Because if you were a fraud or a gold digger, then that would mean my way of doing things, caring about money and status and social position, was the right way after all." She looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. "But you weren't a fraud. You were just someone trying to escape the very thing I'd spent my life chasing. And instead of recognizing that and respecting it, I made your life miserable because it challenged everything I believed about how the world works." The silence stretched between us, filled with 3 years' worth of misunderstandings and missed opportunities. "I called my sister in Boston last night," Patricia continued. "Helen, my older sister. She married a trust fund baby 40 years ago, moved in circles that make the Ashworth family look positively middle class. I told her what happened at dinner, and do you know what she said?" I shook my head. "She said, 'Patricia, that girl was slumming with your family, and you were too stupid to realize it.' Then she explained what the Delacroix name actually means in New York society. Your family doesn't just have money, Camille. They have influence, connections, social standing that people like Charles and Jennifer can only dream of." Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. My sister was appalled, not at you, but at us. At the idea that we'd spent 3 years making one of the most prominent young women in New York State feel unwelcome at our dinner table. She said it was like discovering that someone we'd been treating as a peasant was actually a princess in disguise. "I never wanted to be treated like a princess," I said quietly. "That's exactly what I was trying to avoid." "I know that now," Patricia replied, "but I didn't understand it then. I couldn't imagine why someone would voluntarily step away from that kind of power and privilege. It seemed wasteful, ungrateful even." She set down her coffee cup and looked around my apartment again. "This place, your bookstore, the life you built here, it's all real, isn't it? Not some elaborate performance or rebellion, but actually who you are." "It's who I wanted to be," I said. "I'm not sure if that's the same thing." "Maybe it is," Patricia said thoughtfully. "Maybe choosing who you want to be is more authentic than just accepting who other people expect you to be." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and I realized this was the first real conversation Patricia and I had ever had. All our previous interactions had been filtered through layers of assumption and social performance, each of us playing roles we thought the other expected. "Julian called me this morning," Patricia said eventually. "He's struggling. Not just with the revelation about your family, but with trying to understand why you felt you couldn't trust him with the truth." My chest tightened. I was going to tell him, eventually. I needed to be sure he loved me for the right reasons first. "And how long would that have taken?" Patricia asked gently. "How many years of marriage before you would have felt secure enough to reveal your true identity? How many family gatherings where you had to sit there while we questioned your worthiness?" I didn't have an answer for that, because I'd never really thought about it. I'd been so focused on maintaining my cover story that I'd never developed a plan for ending it. "Can I tell you something?" Patricia asked. "Something I learned too late in my own marriage?" I nodded. "Trust isn't something you build by withholding information until you feel safe. Trust is something you build by sharing information even when it feels risky. By being vulnerable with someone and discovering that they handle your vulnerability with care." Her words hit me like a physical blow. "You think I should have told him from the beginning?" "I think," Patricia said carefully, "that if you had told Julian on your 3rd date that you came from one of the wealthiest families in New York but wanted to live a simple life in a small town, he probably would have fallen in love with your courage instead of spending 3 years wondering what you were hiding from him." I felt tears starting to sting my eyes. But what if he'd only seen the money? What if he'd changed, become different around me because of what I represented? "Then he wouldn't have been the right person for you," Patricia said simply. "But by not giving him the chance to prove he was the right person, you made it impossible for either of you to build something real." After Patricia left, I sat alone in my apartment trying to process everything she'd said. For 3 years, I'd been protecting myself from people who might love me for the wrong reasons, but I'd also been protecting myself from people who might love me for all the right reasons. Despite knowing the complicated truth, I'd been so afraid of being reduced to my bank account that I'd reduced myself to a carefully crafted performance. In trying to avoid being seen as just a wealthy heiress, I'd made it impossible for anyone to see me as a wealthy heiress, who was also a real person with genuine dreams and authentic feelings. The irony was devastating. In my attempt to escape the limitations of my family's money, I'd created even more restrictive limitations for myself. That afternoon, I called my father. "Camille," his voice was warm with relief. "Your mother told me what happened. Are you all right?" "Dad," I said, "I need to ask you something. When you were young, before you took over the family business, did you ever want to be someone else? Someone normal?" My father was quiet for a long moment. "Every day," he said finally. "I wanted to be the kind of person who could walk into a room without everyone calculating my net worth before they decided how to treat me. I wanted friends who didn't see dollar signs when they looked at me." "What changed your mind?" "I realized that running away from who I was didn't make me more authentic. It just made me a coward. The money is part of me, sweetheart, just like your intelligence and your kindness and your love of literature. Pretending it doesn't exist doesn't make you more real. It just makes you incomplete." As evening fell over Millbrook Heights, I stood in my bookstore looking around at the life I'd built with such careful intention. Tomorrow, I was going to have to decide who I wanted to be going forward. The woman who hid from her identity, or the woman who embraced all the complicated, messy, authentic parts of herself, including the ones that came with trust funds and bodyguards and family names that opened doors she'd never asked to walk through. Saturday morning, I made the decision that would reshape everything. I called my assistant manager, Tracy, and asked her to open the bookstore while I drove to Manhattan to meet with my family's legal and financial team. For 3 years, I'd been managing my Millbrook Heights life through intermediaries and carefully structured trusts, maintaining the fiction that I was living paycheck to paycheck. It was time to stop hiding. The drive to the city gave me 3 hours to think about who I wanted to become. Not the person I'd been pretending to be, and not the person my family expected me to be, but some new version that incorporated all the truths I'd been juggling separately. My parents' penthouse overlooked Central Park, 40 floors above the city where I'd grown up feeling like I was living behind glass. When I walked into the familiar marble foyer, my mother rushed to embrace me with the kind of fierce maternal protectiveness that money couldn't buy. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured against my hair. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that alone." "I wasn't alone," I said, pulling back to look at her. "I had Thomas, and I had the truth. Finally." My father emerged from his study, still in his weekend casual clothes, which, being my father, meant perfectly pressed khakis and a sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But his face showed genuine concern, the kind that reminded me that underneath all the wealth and social obligations, he was simply a man who loved his daughter. "Camille," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive cologne and old books, "what do you need from us?" It was such a simple question, but it contained everything I'd forgotten about my family in my rush to escape them. They weren't just wealthy people with complicated lives. They were my parents, and they wanted to help me figure out how to move forward. "I need to do something I should have done 3 years ago," I said. "I need to stop hiding who I am." Over lunch in their private dining room, served by staff who had known me since childhood and greeted me with genuine warmth, I outlined my plan. It was ambitious, probably naive, and definitely risky, but for the first time in years, it felt authentically mine. "I want to expand the bookstore," I told them. "Not just in Millbrook Heights, but as a model for how independent bookstores can serve small communities. I want to create a foundation that helps other people who love books but don't have family money open their own stores. I want to do it openly, as myself, with the Delacroix name attached." My mother set down her fork, studying my face with the intensity she usually reserved for evaluating potential board members for her charitable organizations. "You want to step into the spotlight you've been running from for 3 years. "I want to step into my life," I corrected. "The real one, where I'm both someone who inherited wealth and someone who genuinely cares about connecting readers with books. Where I can use resources I never asked for to support dreams I actually believe in." My father leaned back in his chair, and I could see the business mind that had built the family fortune calculating possibilities and risks. It's a good concept. Literary philanthropy, community development through cultural institutions, supporting small business entrepreneurship in rural areas. The foundation board would approve. "This isn't about foundation approval, Dad," I said gently. "This is about me figuring out how to be whole instead of fragmented." That afternoon, I met with David, my lawyer, and explained what I wanted to do. He listened with the professional attention he'd always given my family's affairs, but I could see surprise in his eyes as I described my vision for transparency and community engagement. "You realize," he said carefully, "that once you step forward as Camille Delacroix, there's no going back to anonymity. Your bookstore will become known as the Delacroix Project. Every decision you make will be scrutinized through the lens of your family's reputation. You'll never again have the luxury of being judged solely on your own merits." "I've never had that luxury anyway," I replied. "I've just been pretending I did. At least this way, people will know exactly who they're dealing with from the start." By Sunday evening, I was back in Millbrook Heights with a comprehensive plan and a team of professionals ready to help me implement it. The foundation paperwork was already in motion, the architectural plans for expanding the bookstore were being drafted, and my family's publicist was preparing a carefully worded press release about my, quote, emergence as a philanthropic leader in literary and community development. But first, I had a more personal matter to address. I'd spent the weekend thinking about Julian, about the 3 years we'd shared and the conversation we still needed to have. Not the conversation where I tried to convince him to forgive me, but the one where we both acknowledged that our marriage had been built on incomplete foundations and decided what, if anything, we wanted to build instead. Sunday night, I called him. "Julian," I said when he answered, "I have something to tell you, something new this time, not just explanations about the past." "I'm listening," he said, though his voice was guarded in a way that broke my heart. "I'm not going to apologize anymore for having money or for trying to protect our relationship from it," I said. "But I am going to apologize for not trusting you enough to let you make your own choices about what my background meant to you." There was silence on the other end of the line. "I'm starting a foundation," I continued, the Delacroix Literary Community Foundation. "We're going to help people open independent bookstores in small towns, provide resources for community literacy programs, support local authors and storytellers. The first major project is expanding my store here in Millbrook Heights into a flagship location that demonstrates how bookstores can anchor community development." "Camille, I'm telling you this not because I want you to be impressed or because I'm trying to win you back," I said. "I'm telling you because for the first time in my adult life, I'm doing something that uses all of who I am, the woman who loves books, the person who believes in community, and yes, the heiress who has resources that can make big dreams possible." Julian was quiet for a long moment. "And you're doing this here, in Millbrook Heights?" "I'm doing this here because this is where I learned what I actually value," I said. "This is where I discovered that I could be happy helping a third grader find the perfect book, that I could feel fulfilled by hosting book clubs and author readings, that I could build something meaningful with my own hands and my own vision." "But now everyone will know," Julian said softly, "about your family, about the money. It'll change everything about how people see you." "Yes," I agreed. "And maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Maybe I need to find out who I am when I'm not hiding half of myself." After we hung up, I walked through my apartment one more time, seeing it with new eyes. Tomorrow, contractors would start the process of connecting my building to the adjacent property I'd just purchased. Within 6 months, what had been a modest bookstore would become the anchor of a literary center that included expanded retail space, a cafe, event spaces for readings and community meetings, and offices for the foundation. It would be beautiful, ambitious, and impossible to hide from. Monday morning brought reporters, not because of anything I'd done, but because someone had leaked the story of Thanksgiving dinner at the Ashworth house. By noon, My phone was ringing with calls from local news stations wanting to know about the mysterious heiress who'd been living secretly in Millbrook Heights. I stood in front of my bookstore, looking at the small crowd of reporters and curious townspeople who had gathered on Maple Street. Some of them were customers who'd shopped here for years, people who knew me as the friendly woman who always had good recommendations and remembered their favorite genres. Others were strangers, drawn by the novelty of discovering that someone famous had been hiding in their midst. Tracy appeared at my elbow, her face worried. "Camille, I can handle the store if you want to slip out the back. This looks overwhelming." I looked at my assistant manager, someone who had worked beside me for 2 years, who had never once questioned my ability to afford high-quality inventory or wondered why I never seemed stressed about monthly sales figures. Tracy had simply accepted me as someone who loved books and wanted to share that love with others. "No," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I think it's time I introduced myself properly." I walked toward the reporters, feeling something shift inside me with each step. For 3 years, I'd been Camille, the bookstore owner, carefully hiding Camille Delacroix. Now I was about to become someone new, someone who was both, and neither and more, than the sum of those partial identities. "Good morning," I said to the gathered crowd, my voice carrying clearly in the crisp November air. "My name is Camille Delacroix, and I'd like to tell you about what we're going to build together." The press conference in front of my bookstore lasted 45 minutes and changed everything. By evening, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets, and by the next morning, national media was calling it "The Heiress Next Door: How America's Wealthy Are Redefining Community Engagement." What I hadn't expected was how the community of Millbrook Heights would react to learning who I really was. The responses ranged from supportive to suspicious to outright hostile, and I found myself navigating social dynamics I'd never experienced before. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery 2 blocks down stopped by the store on Tuesday afternoon, her usual warm demeanor replaced by something cooler and more calculating. "So all this time you've been pretending to be one of us," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "playing at being normal while sitting on millions." "I wasn't pretending to be anything," I replied, continuing to shelve books while we talked. "I was being exactly who I am, someone who loves literature and wanted to create a space where people could connect with books." "But you let us feel sorry for you," Mrs. Henderson persisted. "All those times you talked about the challenges of small business ownership, about making ends meet, about hoping the holiday season would boost sales. We were worrying about you while you could have bought every business on this street." I set down the book I'd been holding and looked at her directly. "Mrs. Henderson, did those conversations feel false to you? When I talked about wanting to find the perfect book for a customer, or when I got excited about discovering a new author, or when I stayed up all night reading manuscripts from local writers, did any of that seem like performance?" She was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with her assumptions. "No," she admitted, "but the money changes things, doesn't it? It makes everything else feel less real." It was a conversation I had dozens of times that week, with customers, neighbors, people I'd considered friends. Some were genuinely curious about my reasons for maintaining privacy about my background. Others were hurt that I hadn't trusted them with the truth. A few were openly resentful, as if my wealth somehow diminished their own accomplishments or made their financial struggles less valid. But the most difficult conversation came on Thursday evening, when Julian appeared at my door. I hadn't seen him since Thanksgiving night, though we'd spoken on the phone several times as news of my foundation plans spread through town. He looked tired, older somehow, like the past week had aged him in ways that went beyond simple lack of sleep. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Really talk, this time?" I let him in, and we sat in my living room where we'd shared so many quiet evenings together. The space felt different now, charged with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that remained unspoken between us. "I've been thinking about what you said," Julian began, "about not apologizing for having money, but apologizing for not trusting me with the truth. And I need to tell you something that I should have said last week." I waited, my heart pounding with the possibility of reconciliation and the fear of final closure in equal measure. "You were right to be scared," he said quietly, "about how the money would change things between us. Because it has changed things, Camille. Not because I want your wealth or resent it, but because learning about it has made me question everything I thought I knew about myself." "What do you mean?" Julian ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make thousands of times when he was struggling to find the right words. "For 3 years, I've been the husband of a woman who I thought shared my financial situation, my background, my perspective on money and success. I felt like an equal partner in our relationship, like I was contributing meaningfully to our life together." My chest began to tighten as I saw where this was heading. "But now I find out that while I was proudly paying half the rent and splitting grocery bills and saving up for months to buy you a nice birthday present, you were, what? Patronizing me? Letting me feel important while knowing you could have solved every financial worry I've ever had with pocket change?" "Julian, that's not how I saw it at all." "Isn't it, though?" He looked at me with pain that cut deeper than anger would have. "When I stressed about whether we could afford to go out to dinner, you knew you could buy the restaurant. When I worried about saving enough for a down payment on a house, you probably owned property I'd never even heard of. When I talked about my dreams of starting my own business, you were sitting on resources that could have funded it 100 times over. I felt like I was losing him all over again, but this time for reasons I couldn't argue with because they weren't based on misunderstanding. They were based on truth. What hurts the most," Julian continued, "isn't that you didn't tell me about the money, it's that you didn't trust me enough to let me choose how to handle it. You made decisions for both of us about what our relationship would look like, about what I could and couldn't know about the person I married." "I was trying to protect what we had," I said desperately. "I was trying to keep money from contaminating something that felt pure and real." "But it wasn't pure and real, was it?" Julian's voice was gentle but devastating. "It was based on incomplete information. How can love be authentic when one person is hiding fundamental truths about who they are?" The question hung between us like a judgment I couldn't appeal. "Here's what I keep coming back to," Julian said. "If you had told me on our first date that you were Camille Delacroix, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune who wanted to live a simpler life, I would have been intimidated. I probably would have assumed you were slumming or playing at normalcy until you got bored and returned to your real world." "Exactly," I said. "That's exactly what I was afraid of." "But at least it would have been my choice to make that assumption," Julian replied. "At least I would have had the opportunity to prove I could see past the money to the person underneath. Instead, you decided for me that I couldn't handle the truth, that I wasn't strong enough or secure enough or whatever enough to love you despite your wealth." I realized he was right, and the realization was crushing. In my attempt to protect our relationship from the corrupting influence of money, I'd corrupted it myself with deception and patronizing assumptions about his character. "The foundation," Julian said, changing the subject slightly. "I've been reading about your plans in the papers. It sounds amazing, truly. You're going to do incredible things for communities like this one." "Thank you," I said, though I could hear the but coming. "But it also proves my point about who you really are. This isn't some small-town bookstore owner who got lucky with investors. This is Camille Delacroix, philanthropist and community developer, using her family's resources to create positive change. It's impressive and inspiring, and it's completely at odds with the person you pretended to be when we met." Julian stood up, and I knew he was preparing to leave. "I don't regret loving you, Camille, and I don't regret the 3 years we had together, even knowing now that they were built on incomplete foundations. But I can't move forward in a relationship where I feel like the junior partner who was never trusted with the full truth." "What if we started over?" I asked, knowing even as I said it that it was impossible. "What if we began again, with everything out in the open this time?" Julian smiled sadly. "How do you start over with someone when you've already seen how they make decisions about trust and honesty under pressure?" How do you build new foundations when you know the other person's instinct is to protect themselves by controlling information? He moved toward the door, then paused. I hope the foundation succeeds, Camille. I hope you find a way to be happy as the person you really are, not the person you thought you had to be. And I hope someday you find someone who you trust enough to share the whole truth with from the beginning. After he left, I sat alone in my apartment, understanding finally that some consequences of our choices can't be undone, even when we've learned from our mistakes. Julian wasn't leaving because he couldn't accept my wealth. He was leaving because he couldn't accept my assumption that he couldn't accept it. The irony was perfect and devastating. In trying to protect him from my money, I'd revealed something about my character that was more damaging to our relationship than any amount of wealth could have been. The next morning, I received an unexpected phone call from Charles. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Camille, his voice was different, less arrogant, more subdued. I owe you an apology, several apologies, actually. Charles, you don't need to. Yes, I do. I've spent the past week reading about your family, about the Delacroix Foundation's work, about the charitable initiatives you've been involved in since college. I made assumptions about your character based on limited information, and I was completely wrong. He paused, and I could hear the effort it took for a man like Charles to admit error. I also need to apologize for my threats about investigation and private detectives. My lawyer advised me that pursuing that course would be inadvisable, given your family's resources and reputation. But more than that, it was wrong. You didn't deserve to be treated like a criminal for choosing privacy about your background. Thank you, I said, though the apology felt both too little and too late. For what it's worth, Charles continued, I think what you're doing with the foundation is remarkable. If there's ever any way I can support the Literary Center project, I hope you'll consider allowing me to contribute. After we hung up, I realized that Charles's call represented a kind of completion. The people who had attacked me at Thanksgiving dinner were now either apologizing or, in Patricia's case, becoming unlikely allies. The community was slowly adjusting to the reality of who I was. The foundation was moving forward with plans that would create real positive change. Everything was working out exactly as I'd hoped it would when I made the decision to stop hiding. Everything except the relationship that had mattered most. 6 months after that Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything, I stood in the grand opening celebration of the Delacroix Literary Community Center, watching hundreds of people explore the space that had once been my small, secret bookstore. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a narrow, 3-story building was now a soaring, light-filled complex that spanned 3 adjacent properties and included everything I'd dreamed of: expanded bookstore space, a cafe with locally sourced pastries, event spaces for readings and community meetings, a children's literacy center, and offices for the foundation that now employed 12 people. The ribbon cutting had drawn officials from Albany, representatives from major publishing houses, and journalists from literary magazines who wanted to document what one reporter called the new model for community-centered philanthropy. But what mattered most to me were the faces of longtime customers who had supported the bookstore when it was just me and Tracy, and a few thousand carefully chosen books. Mrs. Henderson was there, her earlier resentment replaced by genuine enthusiasm as she watched her 8-year-old granddaughter participate in a storytelling workshop led by a children's author we'd flown in from California. I was wrong about you, she'd told me earlier that day. I thought the money would change what this place meant to our community. Instead, it's made it more than we ever imagined it could be. The foundation had already approved grants for 6 similar projects in small towns across New England, with plans to expand nationally within 2 years. We'd partnered with library science programs at 3 universities to develop training materials for independent bookstore owners. The success had exceeded my most optimistic projections, and more importantly, It felt genuinely aligned with everything I'd discovered about myself during my years in Millbrook Heights. Miss Delacroix, Thomas appeared at my elbow with the quiet professionalism that had kept me safe and grounded through every phase of this transformation. The mayor would like to present you with the Community Service Award whenever you're ready. I nodded, smoothing down the dress I'd chosen for today, beautiful but not ostentatious, clearly expensive, but appropriate for someone who no longer needed to hide her resources. Finding the right balance in my public presentation had been one of the unexpected challenges of stepping into my authentic identity. Too modest, and people accused me of false humility. Too elegant, and they said I was flaunting my wealth. I'd learned to dress like exactly what I was, a successful woman who happened to have been born into money and was trying to use it responsibly. As I moved through the crowd toward the small stage where the mayor waited, I caught sight of a familiar figure near the rare books display. Julian, wearing a suit I recognized from our wedding day, was examining a first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird that had been one of my first major acquisitions for the store. We hadn't spoken in 3 months, not since he'd signed the divorce papers that made our separation official. The process had been remarkably civilized. No arguments about assets, since I'd never commingled our finances anyway. No custody issues since we'd never had children. Just the quiet dissolution of a marriage that had been built on incomplete foundations. Seeing him there felt like encountering a ghost of my former life. Not painful anymore, exactly, but deeply melancholy. A reminder of what might have been if I'd been braver about trust from the beginning. After the mayor presented me with a crystal plaque that would probably end up in my parents' penthouse alongside dozens of similar honors, after the last photographer had captured the perfect shot of community leaders celebrating literary philanthropy, after the crowd had dispersed and the cleanup crew had restored the center to its usual elegant order, I found myself alone in the main bookstore space, surrounded by thousands of books that represented both my oldest passion and my newest purpose. "It's beautiful," a voice said behind me. I turned to see Julian emerging from behind the poetry section, his hands in his pockets, his expression carefully neutral. "Thank you," I replied, "both for saying so and for coming today. I know it can't have been easy." "I wanted to see what you'd built," he said simply. "And I wanted to apologize." I blinked in surprise. "Apologize for what?" Julian walked closer, stopping a few feet away. Close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain the emotional distance that had become necessary between us. "For making you carry all the blame for what went wrong between us. I've had 6 months to think about it, and I realized that my reaction to learning about your wealth was part of the problem too." "Julian, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "You were wrong to hide your identity from me, and you were wrong to make assumptions about how I'd handled the truth. But I was wrong too, Camille. I was so focused on feeling betrayed that I couldn't see past my own hurt to understand why you'd been scared to tell me." He gestured around the bookstore, taking in the elegant fixtures, the carefully curated displays, the sense of abundant resources dedicated to a genuine mission. "Looking at all this, seeing how you've used your wealth to create something meaningful and lasting, it makes me realize that you weren't just hiding money from me. You were hiding your capacity to do extraordinary things, your ability to make dreams into reality on a scale I'd never imagined." "I didn't want you to love me for that capacity," I said quietly. "I know. But maybe that capacity is part of who you are, just like your love of books and your genuine care for this community. Maybe hiding it wasn't protecting our relationship. Maybe it was preventing our relationship from becoming everything it could have been." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by books and the ghosts of conversations we'd never had, choices we'd never made, trust we'd never quite managed to build. "I heard you're seeing someone," Julian said eventually, his voice carefully neutral. I nodded. "David Brennan. He's a journalist who's been covering the Foundation's work. We met when he was researching an article about literary philanthropy, and it's been nice Having someone know exactly who I am from day one. No secrets or revelations waiting to complicate things. That sounds healthy, Julian said, and I could hear that he meant it. What about you? I'm good, he replied. Single but good. I've been focusing on getting my outdoor adventure business off the ground. It's slower going than I'd hoped, but I'm learning that I like the challenge of building something completely my own. I smiled, remembering the dreams he used to share about guided hiking trips and wilderness education programs. I'm glad you're pursuing it. Actually, Julian hesitated, then continued, there's something I wanted to ask you. Something I probably should have asked 3 years ago instead of just assuming I knew the answer. What's that? Would you have helped me start the business if I'd asked? Back when we were married, if I'd come to you and said I needed capital to make my dreams happen, would you have said yes? The question hit me like a physical blow, because the answer was so obvious and so complicated at the same time. Of course I would have, I said. But Julian, I would have wanted to help as your wife who loved you and believed in your dreams, not as an investor looking for returns. And I was terrified that you'd never be able to see the difference. Maybe I wouldn't have been able to back then, he admitted. Maybe I would have always wondered if your support was about love or about money. But maybe that would have been my issue to work through, not your secret to protect me from. As evening fell over Millbrook Heights, Julian and I walked together through the literary center one more time, past the children's reading nook where families were still browsing picture books, past the cafe where a few patrons lingered over coffee and novels, past the community meeting room where a book club was already setting up for their weekly discussion. You did something extraordinary here, Julian said as we reached the main entrance. Not just the money. Anyone with enough wealth could have funded this. But the vision, the understanding of what this community needed, the way you've created something that feels both elevated and accessible, that's all you, Camille. Thank you, I said, and meant it. His recognition of what I'd accomplished felt different from the praise I'd received from city officials and foundation boards. More personal, more rooted in understanding of who I'd been before I became the public figure known for literary philanthropy. As he prepared to leave, Julian turned back one more time. I hope you're happy, he said simply. I hope you found the peace you were looking for when you came to Millbrook Heights. I'm getting there, I replied honestly. It's different from what I expected, but it's real in a way my life never was before. After Julian left, I stood alone in the center I'd created, surrounded by thousands of books that held thousands of stories about people who had learned to become themselves despite the obstacles they faced. My story wasn't the one I'd imagined when I first opened a small bookstore above my apartment, but it was mine, complicated, imperfect, authentic in ways that included both my love of literature and my responsibility to use inherited wealth wisely. I thought about the young woman who had driven to Millbrook Heights 5 years ago, desperate to escape the assumptions that came with her family name. She'd been right about some things. Money did complicate relationships, wealth did create expectations and barriers. Inherited privilege did come with obligations she hadn't chosen. But she'd been wrong about the solution. You couldn't find authenticity by hiding fundamental truths about yourself. You could only find it by integrating all the parts of your identity, even the parts that made you uncomfortable. Thomas appeared in the doorway, ready to escort me home to the house I'd finally purchased under my own name, a beautiful colonial on Elm Street that announced clearly that Camille Delacroix had decided to stay in Millbrook Heights permanently. "Ready, Miss Delacroix?" he asked. "Ready," I said, taking one last look at the literary center that represented everything I'd learned about the difference between hiding from privilege and owning the responsibility that came with it. Tomorrow, I would meet with architects about the foundation's next project in a small town in Vermont. Next week, I had lunch scheduled with David, whose easy acceptance of my complicated identity continued to teach me new things about trust and transparency. Next month, I would speak at a conference about community development through cultural institutions, sharing what I'd learned about the intersection of wealth, purpose, and genuine social impact. It was a good life. Not the quiet, anonymous existence I'd once thought I wanted, but something richer and more complex. A life where my family's money was a tool for building the kind of communities I believed in, where my love of books could flourish on a scale I'd never imagined, where my relationships were based on complete truth rather than careful omissions. As Thomas and I walked toward his car, I realized that the scared young woman who had once called her bodyguard to a Thanksgiving dinner had finally learned the most important lesson of all. You couldn't escape who you were, but you could choose what to do with it. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, what you chose to do with it could change not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.